All right, ladies and gentlemen, you are locked on Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman. And today we're talking about whether or not the tryout players the Falcons brought in today on day one of mandatory minicamp will fix their problems in the trenches, why we won't see much of Cordarrelle Patterson this summer. We'll be answering some listener questions about what areas of the Falcons roster they're deepest at and thinnest at, as well as whether or not Desmond Ridder can pull a Russell Wilson and have a big time rookie season this year.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong on Twitter at falcfans, and of course, the host of this world-renowned Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family. In today's episode of Locked On Falcons is brought to you by Blue Nile. Make your moment sparkle with jewelry from BlueNile.com, and Locked On Sports listeners get $50 off purchases of $500 or more. This podcast exclusive includes engagement. Just use code Locked On at checkout. So, guys, we thank you for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. Of course, Locked On Falcons is free and available Monday through Friday on a variety of podcast platforms, including Apple, Odyssey, Google, Spotify, as well as on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to Locked On Falcons on YouTube. Hit that bell, give us a like, and you will get the video version of the podcast the night before the audio drops. So starting off today on day one of the Falcons mandatory minicamp, they had 6 tryout players in the building, including linebacker Dakota Allen, who spent some years as a special teams with the Jacksonville Jaguars, defensive lineman Isaiah Buggs, who's 3 years as a backup nose tackle for the Pittsburgh Steelers, offensive lineman Adam Kuhn, who was a college wrestler before trying out with the Tennessee Titans last summer, defensive lineman Jalen Dalton, who was with the Chicago Bears, shout out to you, Ryan Pace, back in 2019, and was most recently with the Saints last year. You got wide receiver Emeka Emezi, an undrafted free agent out of North Carolina State, who's also one of those bigger wide receivers at 6'3 plus, and offensive lineman Jonathan Harrison, who has been a longtime NFL journeyman backup that has started some games with the Colts and Jets over the past several years, but hasn't played since 2019. So obviously what's notable about that is, 4 out of those 6 players are trench players. And we were told by Arthur Smith earlier this summer in OTAs that the Falcons would be looking to sign some more beef along the trenches as the summer unfolded. But when I'm looking at these 4 guys that the Falcons brought in, I don't know if they're really moving the needle. Buggs spent some time as a backup nose tackle for the Steelers and was productive. If you recall him going back to those Alabama defensive lines that were stacked with guys like Deron Payne and others. But he's essentially a backup caliber NFL talent. At least that's how he's played the last couple of years in the NFL. Harrison has started 42 games in his NFL career from 2014 to 2019 with the Colts and Jets, but essentially is a Josh Andrews caliber type of player that does have some experience playing both left guard and center. But when we talk about the Falcons needing to make moves in the trenches, we're talking about guys that can come in and at the very least compete for starting jobs, if not outright be handed them. Those are players like J.C. Tretter, Quentin Spain on the offensive line. You got defensive linemen like Eddie Goldman, Larry Ogundobi, Danny Shelton, Brandon Williams, Linval Joseph, etc. And again, I'm not against the Falcons signing any of these tryout players, but I think essentially they qualify as camp bodies. Maybe someone like Buggs. Like if you look at my 53-man roster projection, if the Falcons were to sign someone like Buggs, yeah, I'd probably have him making the roster as one of the 53 guys, but he's not going to make a discernible dent in your ability to hold, Nick Chubb instead of him getting 183 yards rushing against you later this season and holding him to 83 yards rushing. Although probably in reality, there's probably nobody that you could sign that's going to make that much of a difference. But I think you need more than camp bodies at this point. You need more than back end rotational players, which is what these guys. You need true blue starters, true blue difference makers. The other news from day one of mandatory minicamp is that Cordarrelle Patterson is getting rest. Right, he had skipped the voluntary portion of OTAs, working out on his own, as is his right to do. And, according to Arthur Smith, he's sort of on a different practice plan moving forward. And the goal is kind of based off of what Arthur Smith said, to get him ready for training camp, not necessarily to see what he can do over these next couple of days in mandatory minicamp. And that totally makes sense to me. And I feel like we're probably not going to see that much of Cordarrelle Patterson as the summer unfolds, not only this week, but when training camp hits. He could be very easily one of those players that gets a couple of days of rest each week, which we've seen the Falcons use in the past with Todd Gurley and Alex Mack and some of these veteran players. And that obviously creates opportunities for a player like Tyler Algier, the Falcons, fifth round rookie running back, to get probably a lot more reps this summer, which hopefully he'll be able to take advantage of those opportunities. And we'll talk about whether we think he will later this week when we get more in depth into Tyler Algier. But again, I think this makes a ton of sense. I gave this coaching staff a lot of grief last summer for not playing guys during the preseason. But I certainly think things are a little bit different this summer. I think Patterson certainly is on the short list of guys that I think it totally makes sense for the Falcons to probably dial back. We know a big part of the reason why Arthur Smith was reluctant to play guys last summer was he was worried about injuries, trying to avoid those injuries with some of the key starters. Patterson's on that list this summer. Pitts is probably on that list this summer. Grady Jarrett, Casey Hayward, AJ Terrell, Jake Matthews, Chris Lindstrom, etc., are some of the guys that are on that list of guys that, whether they get days off on practice or whether or not they basically are non-existent when it comes to the preseason, it totally makes sense for those guys. But for this summer, we want to see opportunities for some of these other unproven players. And that was really my beef last summer, given it was a new offense, a new coaching staff, and a lot of roster turnover. There was a lot of guys out there that you needed to see. Patterson wasn't necessarily one of those guys because we kind of knew what Patterson was, or we thought we did. Obviously, he came in, outperformed expectations in a lot of regards. But I think going into this summer, we'll just sort of have to see. So don't be surprised if Cordarrelle Patterson, is not. This is sort of a prelude to the Falcons trying to get Cordarrelle Patterson healthy to the regular season, because we know he's going to be a big part of this team's offense moving forward this season. And one of, behind Kyle Pitts, is probably the most important X factor for this Falcons offense moving forward. But we'll sort of see if they can do a good job protecting some of those key players like Cordarrelle Patterson as this summer unfolds. But that kind of builds us to our next topic of the day, getting into the Q&A portion of today's episode, where our first question is: which area of the Falcons roster is strongest? Which area is thinnest when it comes to how impactful an injury could be? And we'll get into that as we continue today's episode. But I'm sure you guys have plenty of questions on, how you want to celebrate your special someone with a classic timeless piece of jewelry. And whether you're looking to pop that question or build that one-of-a-kind engagement ring, Blue Nile has these simple online tools that are going to help you build the perfect engagement ring, looking at shape, size, clarity, the handcraft, that perfect gift for that special someone. And whether you're having trouble choosing between a necklace or a bracelet or a ring or some other piece of jewelry, Blue Nile also has the experts on hand 24/7 via phone, via chat, to buy that memorable gift that fits everyone's budget. And all you got to do to make your moment sparkle is go to BlueNile.com, and Locked On listeners get $50 off purchases of $500 or more. And all you got to do is use the promo code Locked On. That's code Locked On, LOCKEDON. And this podcast exclusive includes engagement. Plus, every order is insured. It ships free and arrives in discreet packaging, so you won't give away what's inside. All you got to do is go to BlueNile.com. So shop stress free. Find your forever piece by going to BlueNile.com today. So, guys, I want to thank you for making Locked On Falcons your first listen. And, as a recommendation for what your second listen should be today, why not check out Locked On Sports Atlanta, where you can find 3 different shows covering not only local sports, but also national sports. That's A to Z with Mark Zeno, Hitting Hard with John Chuckery, and ATL Day Ones with Jarvis Davis and Tanisha Batiste, as well as if you subscribe to Locked On Sports Atlanta, which is available on all the same podcast platforms that you listen or watch Locked On Falcons. If you subscribe to Locked On Sports Atlanta on YouTube, you'll also get access to the Locked On Braves postcast, where Locked On Braves is breaking down every Atlanta Braves win and loss for you guys. So find that on your preferred podcast platform. And let's talk about the first listener question we have. It comes from Jim. He emailed at lockedonfalcons@mail.com and asked, given your projection for the final 53-man roster, where would a season-ending injury hurt the Falcons the most? And conversely, where could that roster best absorb a season-ending injury? So I'll give you multiple answers, Jim, because we're at the point where we're still not 100% sold on what we have, particularly in the starting lineup at some of these positions. And we'll talk about where the Falcons are deepest. And I would probably choose between the wide receiver and safety position. Right now, given the expectations for where the starters are going to be, I don't know if there's going to be a massive drop off from who we expect to be the starters at those positions to who are probably going to be the backups. We talked about the safety position earlier this week, talking about Richie Grant and Jalen Hawkins and what expectations they can have this upcoming season. But when you look at Eric Harris and Dean Marlowe, they're proven veterans, not elite veterans by any chance. They're probably at best average NFL starters moving forward. But I don't know if Grant and Hawkins are going to be significantly better than that this upcoming season, as we discussed on the previous episode. They had the potential to be, but whether they are remains to be seen. And so if you were to lose one or more of those guys to an extended injury this season, I think you can be fine on defense. It's not going to suddenly break your defense to go with guys like Harris or Marlowe as your backups coming off the bench this year. Wide receivers kind of in a similar boat. You have 4 guys that I feel like are atop the depth chart, and they're going to be, competing for who's going to be the top 3 guys that are going to get the bulk of the snaps on offense this year. And that's Drake London, Brian Edwards, Demir Burton, and Olamide Zaccheaus. And you can kind of shuffle around those guys in any order you want. You can, have, again, knock on wood, but you don't want to see this happen. But like if one of those guys was to miss extended time, I think you'd be fine with the other 3, right? I know people have high expectations for particularly guys like Edwards and London potentially being a 1,000-yard receiver. Edwards, I don't know what the expectations on him, but I imagine a lot of Falcon fans are expecting like 700, 800 yards out of him this upcoming season. You're not really having those same expectations on Demir Bird or Olamide Zaccheaus, but I don't think really having one of those guys is going to be as critical to your offensive success this year. And it kind of goes back to a conversation we had last year when the Falcons weren't necessarily strong at the wide receiver core due to injuries to Russell Gage and the departure of Calvin Ridley midway through the season. But as I said then, like, you can run your offense through your running back, through your tight end position, and the Falcons certainly have the horses at those spots that you should feel pretty comfortable to be able to do that, even if you have a diminished wide receiver core. I don't think Arthur Smith did a great job of doing that and making that adjustment last season. And, Hayden Hurst basically being a forgotten man, being exhibit A in that example. But going into this year with Patterson, with Pitts, with Ferkser, and the expectation that he'll be able to get more out of that guy, especially Ferkser, than he did Hurst a year ago, I feel like you're moving in the right direction there. So you should be fine, even in the event of an injury to whoever your number 1 wide receiver is, which we assume is going to be Drake London this year. Now, on the opposite end of the spectrum, there are 3 positions that I sort of think are in the conversation for where you're thinnest at. There's tight end, there's defensive line, and cornerback. We just talked about the tight end position. And, while I think Ferkser is going to have a better year than Hayden Hurst and will be a perfectly functional starter in the event of a Kyle Pitts injury, Kyle Pitts is the guy, right? He is the one guy on this team, particularly on the offense, that if you're an opposing team, you're going to look at and say, that's the one guy we're scared of. That's the one guy that's going to give us headaches week in and week out. Like, as good as I think Drake London or Brian Edwards are going to be, like, I don't think they're that guy. Like, I don't think most teams are going to be looking at Drake London, barring him basically pulling a Jamar Chase or a Justin Jefferson and being like one of the 5 to 10 most explosive and dominant receivers in the league right off the bat, which I don't think is likely to happen. I don't think most teams are going to look at those guys and be like, oh yeah, we can't stop them. So the minute Pitts goes down, this Falcons offense, I think, can still function, can still be competent if the play calling is on par, but all of a sudden it becomes extremely ordinary. and probably one of the weaker units in the league if you're not getting high level play from a Drake London or an Anthony Firks or a Cordarrelle Patterson or a Marcus Mariota or whoever the case may be. As for the defensive line, again, part of this, why I'm not putting it sort of top at this list, is because my expectation is that we're going to sign a defensive lineman, better than Isaiah Bucks later this summer. So I'm kind of in wait and see mode. But obviously, losing Grady Jarrett would be a devastating blow to this, not only this defensive line, but also this pass rush. We know he's the one proven pass rusher that this defense has. And, even if they do go out there and sign one of the better available pass rushing D tackles on the market, like a Larry Ogunjobi or Sheldon Richardson or Malik Jackson, none of those guys come close to what we expect out of Grady Jarrett, right? Even in a down year, you look at PFF's pass rush grades for interior defensive linemen. Grady Jarrett last year was still 66th percentile among his position group, and you're expecting him to rebound off of that and have a better year than that. So 75th, 80th percentile, like he has been in previous years at the very least. You compare that to Ogunjobi, was 47th percentile in pass rush grade last year. Richardson was 40th. Malik Jackson was 20th out of 131 interior defensive linemen. And Ndamukong Suh, who's also out there, was 18th. By the way, Taquan Graham was 12th. Marlon Davidson was 7th. And Eddie Goldman was 35th, by the way, which is, reason why I think Eddie Goldman checks both boxes as a pass rusher and a run defender for you. But I digress there. So, Grady Jarrett would be a devastating blow for this team. As for cornerback, obviously we know AJ Terrell is a huge part of this team's success. We saw him miss time at points last year, and it kind of completely changed how the Falcons were going to play defensively because they went to a lot of zone stuff, relying on guys like TJ Green and Chris Williamson. I think upgrading Casey Hayward, upgrading that spot from Fabian Moreau was a big move, step forward, because we know teams tend to make AJ Terrell a no-fly zone and they attack that other cornerback. And, last year that led to Fabian Moreau struggling at times. We're a pro Fabian Moreau podcast here on Locked On Falcons, but we understand that basically at best he was roughly a league average cornerback play. You're expecting considerably more out of Casey Hayward this year. But if you were to lose one of those two guys, you have major question marks in terms of their depth at the outside cornerback position. You feel like after going through a year with Darren Hall, if Isaiah Oliver were to go down, it would be a significant blow. But you feel like you can move forward with Darren Hall and he'll be better in year 2 than he was as a rookie a year ago. But you're kind of holding out. I'm hopeful for cornerback depth will emerge this summer through the power competition. I'm mainly looking at D. Alford, who's flashed some things so far in OTAs, the guy that we picked up from the Canadian Football League. By the way, circling back to tight end position, we also picked up a tight end in Braden Linneus there, but I'm not expecting Braden Linneus to be Kyle Pitts. He's more of a developmental practice squad type of player that I'm expecting this year. Maybe we can continue to develop him beyond that, but we'll see. But I think, D. Alford's the one guy that you hold out hope that ideally, Fabian Moreau is a decent starter, but ideally is more of a backup for you. And I think D. Alford, you're kind of the one guy out of this, cornerback room that you're looking at and say, okay, maybe that guy could be a Fabian Moreau type of player that could give you valuable production off the bench in the event of an extended injury for a Casey Hayward or an AJ Terrell, and suddenly you're not relying on a TJ Green or a Chris Williamson type of liability there. Which, no offense to the Corey Ballentines and the Cornell Armstrongs and the Lafayette Pitts, shout out to Pitt, but I'm not expecting those guys to come in and give you positive earnings. Now, I could be wrong about that, but I think D. Alford's the one guy that you're holding out hope. Like we talk about the zone coverage grades earlier this week with, Hayward, Terrell, and Oliver being one of the top trios in the league when it comes to zone coverage. But Fabian Moreau, again, part of the reason why we're pro Fabian Moreau on this podcast, like, again, he was competent there, right? He was 56th percentile when it came to his zone coverage grade, according to PFF. Now, obviously, that's a big drop off from where Casey Hayward was last year, 99th percentile, AJ Terrell, 96th percentile. So that's a big drop off, but that's still competent, above average, slightly above average starting cornerback play. And that's kind of what we're hoping for D. Alford this upcoming season. So that's why I don't put cornerback above, some of these other positions like tight end and defensive line. So we'll just sort of see how the competition goes. Obviously, you can look at other positions along the offensive line. Like if you were to lose Jake Matthews and you had to turn to like Elijah Wilkinson or Rick Leonard to start at left tackle, bad things are going to happen. But we kind of already think the offensive line is going to be terrible, even with a healthy Jake Matthews. Or again, not everybody thinks that, but you know what I'm saying? Like, so like you're going from the 23rd best offensive line to the 32nd offensive line. If you lose Jake Matthews, yeah, your offensive line is not going to be able to function without Jake Matthews healthy in the lineup, but it's arguably not going to be able to function with Jake Matthews in the line unless certain other players really make big step ups this season. So we'll see about that. And if those guys do make the big step up this season, then maybe you can survive a Jake Matthews injury. So that's really more what's at stake at the offensive line position. But we'll see how that goes. So I hope that answers your question, Jim. And we got one more question talking about whether or not Desmond Ridder can pull a Russell Wilson. And we'll talk about what exactly that means as we continue today's Locked On Falcons podcast, guys. But before we get there, guys, I do want to let you know that the ultimate NBA mock draft starts on the Locked On Network starting tomorrow. First pick is tomorrow, Thursday, June 16th. And all you got to do is to search Ultimate NBA Mock Draft on your preferred podcast platform. You'll get insight from all the local Locked On experts on the NBA side of things. You'll get Odyssey experts. You'll get big board draft experts, all on your preferred podcast platform. And guys, I also want to tell you about Built Bar, the protein bar that tastes just like a candy bar. It's even better than a candy bar because Built Bars not only taste good, they're good for you. They're low in sugar, low in calories, low in carbs, high in protein, high in fiber. They're all covered in 100% real chocolate. They come in a variety of flavors. You can get granola bars like chocolate peanut butter, caramel brownie, brownie batter puff, churro puff, cookies and cream, double chocolate, coconut almond, cherry barcia, mint brownie, salted caramel, raspberry, or peanut butter brownie. Choose your favorite or try them all with a mix box by going to built.com and using the promo code LOCK15, and you'll get 15% off your order. That's promo code LOCK15, LOCKED15 for 15% off at built.com. So our next question comes from Tim. Again, another email that he sent to lockedonfalcons@mail.com. He says, so let me ask you this. Did Desmond actually beat out Marcus in a one-on-one quarterback battle from start to finish going through the preseason? Could he Desmond Russell Wilson this thing? My follow-up question to you, Tim, is why are we comparing him to Russell Wilson? Because it depends on what you mean by Russell Wilson this thing to determine whether my answer is yes or no. If you're saying we're comparing him to Russell Wilson because they're both third-round picks, and we saw Wilson upset Matt Flynn, air quotes for those who listen to the audio version of the podcast, in camp to become the starter for the Seahawks that year, and we could see Ridder also upset Marcus Mariota this summer. Sure, that's possible. I've said it before. I don't think it's likely, but it's possible. I've given the odds, and I'm pulling these numbers out of my butt, but I say it's like a 30% chance that, Desmond Ridder is the week one starter. If Ridder's going to beat out Mariota, I think he's going to need a little bit more help, given that I think Mariota is significantly better than what Matt Flynn was. And for those of you guys that are unfamiliar with the legend of Matt Flynn, don't remember what the league was like in the Seahawks, a decade ago, Matt Flynn was signed by the Seahawks that offseason in 2012 after he had sort of two impressive late season starts in the two previous years with the Packers as a backup to Aaron Rodgers. Had like something like 850 yards and like 9 touchdowns and 2 interceptions across those two starts. And so the Seahawks basically took a flyer on him out of desperation because they were so desperate to find a replacement for Matt Hasselbeck. They had tried Charlie Whitehurst. They had tried the late Tarvaris Jackson, RIP, and were looking for anybody at that point, and we're willing to basically give Matt Flynn a sizable contract at that time to basically be their new starter based off of 2 starts, right? In today's money, Matt Flynn's contract back in 2012 was comparable to what the Saints just gave Jameis Winston to be their starter. But we know Jameis Winston started 77 career games, and Matt Flynn had 2 up to that point. It would basically be the equivalent of a team today basically going to the Rams and saying, we'll pay John Wolford, Jameis Winston money. And for those of you not familiar with John Wolford, he was the guy that replaced Jared Goff in that Rams playoff game like 2 years ago and was like halfway decent running around and doing stuff. But by no means are you going to go out there and pay that guy $12-14 million a year or whatever the case may be based off of 1 or 2 games that he's played. So in hindsight, we look at that, it's the difference between beating Jameis Winston and beating John Wolford. Of course, we look back in hindsight and it's like, of course, Russell Wilson won that starting job to Matt Flynn. That's why I use the air quotes upset, because it wasn't really an upset in hindsight. Now, I think beating out Marcus Mariota is not the same, right? Marcus Mariota, who has 60 plus career starts, is not going to be the same. Now, if you're comparing Desmond Ridder to Russell Wilson because you're hoping that he has a comparable level of success right away, given their similarities and draft selection and whatnot, I'm going to sit here and tell you that that's probably not going to happen. It's very, very, very unlikely to happen. right? Because Wilson had a strong supporting cast. He already joined a team that had an established defense. That Seahawks defense, the year before Russell Wilson arrived in 2011, Hardy had a top 10 defense. They were seventh in scoring defense, ninth in total defense, ninth in DVOA, fifth in takeaways, fifth in third down defense, 11th in red zone efficiency, fourth in yards allowed per carry, and sixth in passer rating allowed. Right? They basically improved in pretty much every single one of those categories the following season, and then got a big boost from Marshawn Lynch, who had 1,200 yards rushing in 2011, and then had nearly 1,600 yards rushing in 2012, Wilson's rookie season. You know, the team that was dead last in pass attempts in that 2012 year, that was the Seattle Seahawks, right? They ran their offense through the running game, and they had the defense that could win that way, right? You know, Wilson took off really in the second half of the season down the stretch that year as a rookie, and led that Seahawks team to be one of the better teams entering the postseason. But when you look at the start of their 2012 season, they started the season 4-4, and then they finished like 7-1 to go 11-5 that year, right? But in those first 8 games, they were 27th in points scored, through the first 8 games of the season. Basically, for those first 2 months, they were winning games 17-14. They were losing games 20-17, right? And that was basically all Wilson was capable of achieving. And they had built a team that was capable of winning that way until Wilson turned things around later in that season. They started dropping 50 burgers by the time we got to December, where Wilson was ready to really be the guy, right? And the reason for this, and I bring this all up because being a rookie and being a quarterback at rookie quarterback, being a rookie is hard, and being a rookie quarterback is even harder. And very few guys, almost nobody, is capable of coming into the league right away and playing at a high level if they don't have a supporting cast that can take pressure off of them by either running the football or playing really great defense. And ideally, like the Seahawks did, you can do both, right? And that's why I continue to bring up the supporting cast component of this situation with the young quarterbacks. And I continue to talk about things like Matt Ryan's success being tied to Michael Turner, and saying things like Michael Turner's not walking through that door, guys. Marshawn Lynch not walking through that door. Legion of Boom is not walking through that door. And I've used in the past Gardner Minshew and Justin Herbert as, sort of outliers of guys that had relative success for rookie quarterbacks, were above average to good starting quarterbacks right away in the league, but didn't have great supporting cast, didn't have a top 10 rushing attack, didn't have a top 10 defense, those sorts of things like Matt Ryan had when he came into the league, like Russell Wilson had, Dak Prescott, etc. Right? But we also need to know that with both Gardner Minshew and Justin Herbert, they joined teams in the Chargers and Jaguars that 2 years prior to their arrival were playoff teams, right? The Jaguars were in the AFC Championship game in 2017 before drafting Gardner Minshew in 2019. The Chargers were 12-4 in 2018 under Phillip Rivers before drafting Justin Herbert in 2020, right? Now, they weren't the same team 2 years later, but they still had a lot of those pieces left over that made them strong, like the Jaguars on defense, the Chargers on offense, right? It's been 4 years since the Falcons have been a playoff team. And so, like, me sitting here telling you that, oh, like, this team is ready made to go and all these, that would just be me blowing smoke up your butt. And I don't say all these things to be negative, but like, if you're looking at day 2 quarterbacks that have gone on, that have joined teams like the Falcons are, which is a team that's been, for 4 or more years without making the postseason, you're looking at over the last, 15 years, you're looking at basically Mike Glennon and Derek Carr as the 2 best guys in terms of their rookie year impact. And in their rookie year, the Bucs went 4-12 under Glennon in 2013, and the Raiders went 3-13 in 2014 under Derek Carr. Now, Glennon's rookie year was year 2 of Greg Schiano after a year after they went 7-9 in year 1 under Greg Schiano. Greg Schiano only lasted through his second season, wore out his welcome in Tampa. They hired Lovie Smith to sort of be that player-friendly coach that Greg Schiano wasn't. And then 2 years later, they were drafting Jameis Winston number 1 overall. And so Mike Glennon basically had that 1 year as a starter before they moved on to Josh McCown and ultimately Jameis Winston. Right now, Carr's rookie season, he saw his head coach, Dennis Allen, get fired after a month of the season, starting out the season 0-4. And then thereafter, they brought in Jack Del Rio. In Carr's second year, they went 7-9. And in Carr's third year, they went 12-4 and went to the postseason. Now, then they went like 5 years, between making the playoffs that year and then again. But, let's just look at, the first 3 years of Derek Carr as a sort of success story in that regard. And they built off of that, year 1, year 2, and year 3, right? And so you're hoping for a similar outcome, in my opinion, if you're a Falcon fan looking at the Falcon situation currently, minus obviously the Raiders coaching change. Despite my criticism of Arthur Smith, I'm not looking for him to get replaced anytime soon. I'm rooting for him to be successful, not rooting for him to fail. But when I look at the Raiders and how they were able to build that up, a big reason of why they were able to build it up, because shortly thereafter, after Carr's arrival in year 2, they went out and spent big money on free agents in the offensive line. And by the time they made the playoffs in 2016, they had what was widely considered to be the best offensive line in football that year. Right? They went out and spent big money on Donald Penn and Rodney Hudson and Kelechi Osemele, in addition to the draft pick I think they had of Gabe Jackson. So I think there are lessons there to be learned, guys. And by the way, Derek Carr wound up beating out Matt Schaub for the starting spot his rookie year. Matt Flynn was actually with the Raiders the previous year and lost his starting battle to Terrell Pryor that previous year. But when we're comparing Marcus Mariota to one of these guys, like, I think he's much better than Matt Flynn, but I don't know if he's better than Matt Schaub. But we'll see how that goes. So again, I think when we're looking at the rebuilding path for the Falcons, like Desmond Ridder, I think can be fine, guys, and can ultimately be a good quarterback. But if you're expecting him to come in and just wave a magic wand and suddenly make this Falcon team good for reasons, I think you're making a false hope. And so like I look at the Raiders as a model for us, right? That we may struggle, we may win 4 games or 5 games or whatever the case may be this year, but we can build off of this with the cap space that we have, go out there and fix this offensive line, go out there and fix this running game, go out there and continue to build up the defense, which is, headed in the right direction, but we just need to maybe throw a couple of dollars around to get it really going where we need it to be, and we can build this thing. Don't expect all these results to happen in year 1 is the point I'm trying to make. Years 2, years 3, sure, that's what we're building towards. This is a rebuild. Remember, this is a rebuild. So if you're asking me, can Desmond Ridder be Russell Wilson in terms of success right away? No. But can he be Derek Carr? Sure. I think that's a very, very, very realistic goal. So that's where we're going to leave it, guys. And we'll continue talking about the offensive line and a running game as this week unfolds, as we'll start to get into Tyler Algier. Tomorrow, the plan is to have Matt Waldman on, and we'll talk a little bit about Tyler Algier. We'll also have Thor Nystrom. It's been so long since I talked to Thor that we're finally getting to the Tyler Algier portion of that conversation that we had with Thor. And we should get to all of that on tomorrow's episode and then culminate this week with a Tyler Algier scouting report and breakdown. So you'll hear my thoughts on whether Tyler Algier, how close he can get to being basically Marshawn Lynch 2.0 later this week. Spoiler alert, I'm not going to necessarily expect Tyler Algier to get 1,200 yards rushing this year. I hate to break the news, but we'll see. Like maybe we can get 900. Maybe that's possible. I think that's possible. So we'll get to there later this week, guys. But appreciate you for tuning in. If you want to send in future questions to be answered on future episodes, or you want to provide your feedback on today's episode or previous episodes, of course, you can hit me up via email at lockedonfalcons@mail.com, just like Tim, just like Jim did. You can also hit me up on Twitter or Facebook at Locked On Falcons, or you can leave a comment here on the Locked On Falcons YouTube page, right? And guys, before we duck out of here, as a recommendation for what your second listen after we thank you for making Locked On Falcons your first listen, why not check out, of course, the Locked On NFL podcast, as well as the Ultimate NBA Mock Draft, which kicks off tomorrow on Thursday, as most of you guys are listening to it. So make sure you search for Ultimate NBA Mock Draft in your preferred podcast app, and you will find it. Guys, appreciate it. Till then.